11 January 1944. Central Germany broken winter cloud over the Oschersleben Halberstadt corridor. B-17 boxes grind east in tight cold geometry vapor, streaming from turrets and waste hatches. Lead and high groups call bearings as specks on the horizon harden into lines of fighters, then wings and noses. The flak gate is still ahead. The worst minutes are supposed to be now deep in German airspace between the last handoff and the target turn. Interphones crackle with short commands. Guns are test-fired belts, slapped, sights checked. Everyone knows the arithmetic the Luftwaffe aces like to recite unescorted minutes equal burning fortresses. From the south, a P-51B lifts above the bomber track nose, flashing as it rolls upright and drops its nose across the axis of attack. Major James Howard skims the lead element's right shoulder, a single silver sliver, against a sky full of contrails, then pitches up into the path of the first FTU 190 seconds. His first burst scatters a firing run, not a duel but a cut in timing. The German line kinks, one fighter jinks away, another crosses too early, and the neat carousel becomes noise. Howard resets high yanks across and drags a BF-109 wide of the lead box. In the fortresses, gunners call out the passes, and the strange constant, the Mustang, is still with us. The bomber stream claws forward. Oxygen masks ice at the seams, boots cramp against spars, and the ball turret hums as it tracks the next bracket, coming in from 10 o'clock high. Jagdgeschwader 11 pushes in under Major Günther Specht with elements of Jagdgeschwader, one rolling from the far side, as Oberst Walter Ossau's pilots search for the seam where escorts usually fall away. They expected the old script, one clean slash at an uncovered box, a boarding house for claims. Instead, the same Mustang falls through them again, a vertical slash, then a flat scissor that kicks another attacker off the formation's throat. Howard's guns cough, then stutter. He nurses what he has, switching to short, precise bursts, and using position to break aim rather than chase kills. A fortress in the high group takes hits and staggers. The formation tightens around it, and the gunners punch back with long, arcing tracers. The German second wave forms up for a disciplined pass, heavy and fast nose guns already sparkling. Howard slides in from sunward, crossing their sightlines at the moment of commit. Another pass dies in fragments. The bomber leader checks the stopwatch to the initial point and keeps the boxes stapled to their altitudes. The crew in the lead ship feels it most clearly. The corridor that was supposed to bleed them is holding. Radio calls carry the edge of surprise. Mustang, still on station. Fighters broken up, pressing. There is no celebration in the voices, only the clipped cadence of crews who understand their survival depends on distance and discipline. Far below, the winter fields pace by in gray panels. Far ahead, the smoke columns of Oschersleben lean in the wind. The Luftwaffe tries again, building speed and dive angles for the definitive strike, but each setup runs into the same obstacle, a long-range escort that refuses to drop off. Over the target leg, the fortress noses settle. Bombardiers talk crews onto the run, and the boxes ride a straight line through flak that thumps and blossoms black at their altitudes. The German aces have not vanished. They are still there, firing, maneuvering, trying to rebuild order out of disrupted attacks. But the calculus has shifted. A single Mustang has bought the one commodity daylight bombing needs and rarely gets in the heart of the Reich time in formation. The first sticks go down. The turn home waits beyond the smoke, and the last ragged passes. In the quiet between bursts, the thought hardens in cockpits and debrief notebooks alike when the escorts stay all the way in the old daylight script breaks. November 1943 to May 1944. Set the hard window for deep daylight tests over the Reich, and the date in focus. 11 January 1944 sits in the middle of that experiment. The premise seems simple on paper: push B-17 boxes far enough to hurt aircraft production while keeping losses within a band the 8th Air Force could stand. The Luftwaffe wrote a different equation. Veteran interceptor leaders, pilots who had cut their teeth in the West in 1940 and bled the bomber streams in 1943, believed there was always a minute where escorts thinned, timing aligned, and a disciplined carousel of BFS. 109 seconds, and FOU 190 seconds could slice open a lead box. Daylight raids would keep coming, they said. By January 1944, the U.S. Command chain for this test was locked. Lieutenant General James Doolittle had just taken over the 8th Air Force with a mandate to break the fighter force rather than only avoid it. 8th Fighter Command, under Major General William Kepner, built the escort scheme in relays, early covers out of England, and the coast then depth escorts, with the legs and fuel to ride the bomber, run to the initial point and through, bombs away. The new instrument was the P-51B, with drop tanks flown deep by groups like the 354th Fighter Group out of Boxted. The bomber side carried its own discipline 1st and 3rd Air Division B. 17 groups trained to hold formation geometry under fire, because defensive arcs only work when the box stays a box. On the German side, responsibility for Reich defense converged under the fighter leadership that had learned to husband pilots and concentrate shock. General der Jagdflieger, Adolf Galland, pressed his Gruppen to hit in mass, not dribble. In central Germany, the belt of bases feeding interceptors into the Oschersleben-Halberstadt corridor put Jagdgeschwader 11 under Major Gunther Specht and Jagdgeschwader 1 under Oberst Walter Oisau into the path of a bomber. Stream the weather had already frayed. Their plan was doctrine by then vector to a point ahead of the box use altitude to build a fast head-on or quartering first pass rollout reform and repeat. If the escorts dropped or drifted at the handoff, the kill window opened. Claims and wreckage from 1943 proved the method worked when timing was their own. The map for the day explains the pressure. Fortresses lifted from East Midland stations and ran the North Sea ingress before turning toward Magdeburg. The Ego Oschersleben works sat behind predictable flak belts and a series of fighter assembly points the Luftwaffe had charted by practice. Bomber leaders could not simply dodge. The aim point demanded a straight, stabilized run through the last minutes where flak and fighters overlapped. The escort design tried not to chase every raid threat, but to address the geometry that killed boxes, stop clean setups, break attack rhythm, and preserve formation spacing long enough to reach bombs away with most guns still manned. Performance numbers mattered only insofar as they shaped that rhythm. A P-51B could climb back above an attack and reset for another disruptive pass without burning all of its energy or fuel. With external tanks, it could still be present at the moment. Bomber interphones switched from lookout calls to calm voice commands for the bomb run. A Bf-109 or Fu-190, diving into a head-on attack, carried a brutal first punch. But that punch depended on a stable picture and a sight picture free of an escort cutting across at the commit point. Fortresses with all guns alive could throw dense volumes of fire, yet their arcs opened holes whenever spacing stretched a straggler edged out or a quadrant went uncovered. The measure of success for the escort then was not tallies, but denial how many firing runs died before they were clean. The OOB for both sides brought human names to those abstractions. In the lead escort sector, Major James Howard, a squadron leader in the 354th, 356th Fighter Squadron, found himself carrying that denial burden when clouds and fuel math thinned the cover. He was not tasked to stage a duel, but to make the carousel fail its timing. In the German ready rooms, Specht and Oisau were counting on a familiar script, one pass to smash discipline and force a cripple out, then another to finish the kill and shake the box. Their Staffelkapitän had flown this page many times. Their crews could recite the callouts in their sleep. Stakes lived in columns of numbers, not in slogans. The 8th could keep flying deep only if losses per 1,000 sorties stayed within a band that planners back in High Wycombe could justify to commanders and to men. A single broken pass could spare an entire box, the widening spiral that created falling fortresses. For the Luftwaffe, the arithmetic cut the other way. Every massed intercept burned fuel and airframe hours that maintenance crews were struggling to supply. More dangerous than fuel was attrition of leaders experienced. Rottenführer and Staffel leaders were the irreplaceable component. A disrupted attack might show no wrecks on the ground, but it still cost irreplaceable minutes, energy, and focus that could not be rebuilt fast enough as more raids stacked the calendar. The atmosphere in the airframes sharpened those stakes. In B-17 noses, bombardiers rehearsed the run while chin gunners watched for the flash of muzzle fire on the high 10 line. Waist gunners flexed frozen hands and fought basic mechanical gremlins belts that walked guns that heated sights that fogged. In the German cockpits, veterans calibrated their dive and judged whether the escort picture looked thin enough to justify a head-on commit. The surprise on 11 January was not that Mustangs appeared, it was that they stayed. When one escort crossed the sight lines at precisely the moment of commit, the pass died. When he climbed back up and did it again, lines of approach lost sync. The carousel depended on order. A single spoiler turned it to fragments. Command decisions on both sides had led to this contest of timing and endurance. Doolittle's guidance gave fighter leaders permission to seek and break the interceptors. Kepner's structure gave them the fuel to be present, where it counted. German leadership knew how to concentrate force, but could not conjure fresh veteran pilots to turn failed passes into second chances. The episode did not make daylight gentle. It proved a narrower claim, inside the title's myth. If Deep Escort rode the bomber run all the way to the aim point, the slaughter window could be held closed long enough for the mission to make military sense. The Reich defense in early 1944 trusted a choreography stack. Bf-109 and Fw-190 Staffeln. Ahead of the stream, build speed from altitude, drive a head-on or quartering pass at an uncovered quadrant rollout reform, repeat before and after the initial point. The geometry worked when timing stayed pure. It unraveled when an escort crossed the sight picture at the moment of commit. That is the hinge on which the Oschersleben run turns. The tools on both sides mattered only in how they bent that moment. Bf. 109. G pilots came downhill with a motor cannon punching through a fortress nose, some ships lugging underwing cannon pods that traded roll rate for punch. 190A. Pilots carried 420mm cannon and sometimes a pair of WGR 21 rockets set to burst in the path of a box to rattle crews and force spacing errors. Every kilogram added to an interceptor's wings or rails cost energy in the climb back to reform. Every second burned in reform cost opportunities, fuel, and altitude. The carousel depended on a first pass that went exactly to plan. The bomber side carried its own arithmetic. A B-17 box lives or dies on spacing. Too loose, and arcs no longer overlap too tight, and collision fear breaks gunnery. The chin turret of the G model strengthened the forward quadrant, but did not remove the need for formation discipline under fire. The bowl tail and waist guns throw real weight only when multiple stations overlap a single attacker, and that requires geometry the enemy is trying to break. Fortress crews know their guns are deterrent more than scalpel. Their best weapon is a stable minute to the aim point. The P-51B does not change the war by brochure statistic. It changes that minute. External tanks bought presence in the deepest part of the route. Speed and climb let a pilot reset above the fight and re-enter with options. The escort's task on 11 January is not to paint, kill marks, it is to ruin commit points. When a Mustang cuts across a forming head-on pass, the attacker must jink. One jink at the wrong moment turns perfect geometry into a bad snapshot, and a bad snapshot into a missed pass. That missed pass often forces a long reform, and the long reform moves the next attack outside the bomb run. Over the Oschersleben-Halberstadt corridor, the weather did the Luftwaffe a favor by scattering the planned handoffs. Bomber interphones carried the clipped cadence that means discipline is strained but holding. The first German wave gathered with the assurance that had been earned against unescorted boxes in 1943. Jagdgeschwader 11 came in under Major Gunther Specht with the confidence of men who had seen boxes tear open under a hard coordinated head-on. Elements of Jagdgeschwader 1 converged from the far side. Oberst Walter Oesau's pilots, reading the vapor patterns for the seam where escorts usually slip away. The seam did not open. A single P-51B, flown by Major James Howard of the 354th Fighter Group, refused to drop off the formation. He did not wait for a turning duel. He threaded along the line of approach and showed up in the one place an interceptor cannot ignore across the nose at commit. The first FT-190 section broke its run into 2 ragged pieces, one pilot jinking high, the other low, their cannon sparkles briefly lighting the wrong air. Howard climbed, rolled, and put himself again where the next bracket needed a clean picture. Gunners in the lead box watched his passes not as theater, but as breathing space. The guns inside the fortresses grew sharper when the pass was late. Defenders shot longer, calmer bursts when they were not about to be cut. Rocket intimidation appeared once as a pair of WGR 21 seconds blinked into the bomber lane, more morale weapon than surgical blade. The outer elements wavered, but the formation recovered because the escorts were still physically present over the box, visible in windscreens and turret glass. Rockets do not aim, they herd. Herding needs a hole, and Deep Escort is in the business of sealing holes. One fortress in the high group took cannon strikes that cracked plexiglass and nicked a spar. The bomber leader called for a subtle tighten, and the crews obeyed, knowing that spacing protects a wounded bird better than heroics. The inevitable finishing pass began to assemble on the stragglers' quarter. Howard dropped in a flat, fast cross, not to chase the attacker into a tail chase, but to cut the angle where the German sight needed a quiet 2 seconds. 2 seconds, vanished. The attacker broke off the wounded ship, clawed back under arcs, and a kill that looked almost guaranteed dissolved into frustration. From the German cockpit view, the day became a fight against entropy. Each pass demanded energy, put in during the climb, a clean merge, and enough time afterward to reform into something disciplined. Each spoiled commit stole the glue the carousel needs to look like a carousel. Veterans can improvise for one pass. The second and third improvisations burn the fuel that gets a pilot home. Staffel leaders called for calm rebuilt wedges and tried again. The clock ticked toward the initial point, while one persistent Mustang kept showing up in exactly the wrong place. On the American side, the mechanical facts of life never vanished. Oxygen masks, iced guns, heated and jammed, belts walked and frustrated, gunners cleared stoppages with numb fingers. Howard's own guns coughed and stuttered. He rationed what worked and substituted position for volume. Over the interphone, bombardiers called small corrections to hold the straight line that bombs demand. A fortress crew is trained to ignore heroics. The best they can ask of an escort is a steady, boring minute under fire. The P-51B delivered boredom by force. Numbers lurk underneath the noise. Every failed pass protected dozens of men. Every clean pass had a chance to create a straggler, and a straggler is a carcass the next wave tears open. Prevent one straggler and the defensive arcs for 24 guns remain intact. On the other side, every reform burned minutes and leaders the Reich defense could not afford to throw away forever. Worse than fuel was the fatigue of leaders. The men who held formations together in the face of frustration were the men Germany could least afford to lose, and frustration itself is corrosive. The day did not need to scatter wrecks over Saxony to debit the Reich's fighter force. It needed to turn neatly scripted intercepts into disordered, fuel-hungry fragments. Personalities shaped the frame. Lieutenant General James Doolittle's guidance to engage and erode the fighter force gave escort leaders freedom to disrupt, rather than shadow timidly. Major General William Kepner's relay plan put fuel where the fight actually happened. General der Jagdflieger Adolf Galland wanted mass at the right point on the bomber track, and got it only to find that mass without timing is weight without leverage. Specht and Oiso read the same sky they had read for months, and found that a single stubborn escort could vandalize their arithmetic. The hardware's last contribution is mundane. A P-51B, with drop tanks, still had the legs to be physically present when bombardiers steadied the Norden and the lead ship settled for the run. Presence, not paper range, is what mattered. A fortress box, with its chin turrets, manned tail and waist arcs overlapping and spacing, measured in wingspans rather than guesses, could make a minute under head-on threat survivable. ABF 109 or FW 190, built for violent first passes, punished hesitation, but had little tolerance for a picture that moved under it at the instant of squeeze. By the time the stream crossed the flak gate and the sticks went down, the contest's logic was visible in cockpit glass and debrief notebooks. The Luftwaffe had not vanished. It had been made late. Late meant the bomb run happened with most guns manned and most ships inside arcs. Late meant the return leg began with formations intact rather than trailed by burning singles. Late meant the Reich defense logged effort and fatigue with fewer results than its leaders promised when they briefed the morning's carousel. What the day proved sits exactly inside the title's claim. Aces who counted on deep Reich minutes to turn bomber streams into claims found those minutes compressed by escorts that would not leave. The P-51 did not have to destroy the interceptors to succeed. It had to destroy their timing. Frost trails feather off the wing roots, and the cockpit smells faintly of oxygen and cold metal polish. In the lead fortress, the bombardier settles his elbows against the cradle, closes one eye behind the glass of the sight, and keeps the IP clock inside his head. The navigator behind him runs drift lines in pencil that barely marks on a chart stiff, with cold calling a half-degree correction that will keep the aim point steady when the flak pattern thickens. The top turret engineer watches manifold pressure and cylinder head temperatures hover at their winter limits and bumps cowl flaps a notch to keep the engines from crossing into the red. The interphone is all clipped, words 10 high, 10 low, clear tightening steady. Forward, the chin turret snaps short economical bursts to keep the front quarter honest without burning belts. This is the minute where discipline is oxygen. The ball gunner breathes shallow to keep ice from building on his mask rim. He tracks high side brackets with a movement so small it is just pressure on foot rings and fingertips against the grips. At his back, the structure hums with the particular vibration of formation power. To his left, the waist gunner pulls a hot barrel with a rag and slides in a fresh one with a click that feels louder than gunfire. The tail gunner has the longest view and the tightest muscles. He reads the weave of silver shapes in the distance and tells the pilot when the line of approach starts to look like an attack instead of a parade. The first pass forms. You do not see heroes in this glass. You see geometry. A wedge hardens out of the haze and begins to swell the nose lights of cannon flickers like quick stars. Then a silver needle slides across the picture at exactly the wrong instant for the men in that wedge, and the picture breaks. A fighter jinks high, another snaps low, a third holds half a second too long, and then has to throw away the shot to stay alive. The escort climbs out of their sightlines and vanishes toward the sunline again. The gunners inside the box do not cheer. They breathe deeper and return to measured bursts, to checks, to spacing calls. In a P-51, be above and slightly forward of the lead box, a pilot keeps the bomber formation centered in his canopy and everything else subordinate to that reference. He has done the fuel math with externals and knows exactly how many vertical resets he can afford before this leg turns hard. The guns are not perfect today. One wing coughs, another gun stutters. He moves his thumb like a man rationing matches in a blackout and uses position where volume fails. The sun is off his right shoulder, the threat axis off his left. The bombers under him are the constant. He sees a head-on attempt coalescing two pairs, setting up a clean commit with a time to IP that says they know their trade. He rolls, draws a diagonal, cut across both nose lines, and watches for the telltale twitch. The tiny lift of a wing that means the sight picture is gone. It comes. He does not follow. He climbs back to where the next bracket will appear. In the fortress, the bombardier can feel the flak gate in the changes to the world around him before he sees the bursts. The ship trembles differently as the pilot adjusts for the first black flowers at altitude. He tells the pilot he has the run, and the airplane stiffens with that particular stillness of a stabilized attack. The navigator calls wind and drift small numbers that matter more than fear. The engineer reports fuel in terse blocks, the pilot says steady, and the chin turret sends two brief arcs at a speck angling across the nose. The ball gunner watches the escort flash back into view for a heartbeat, and then vanish up the ladder, and for the first time he lets the muscles in his shoulders drop a fraction. Far above the fields of Saxony, a Rottenführer rides the dive into the merge. The W-190 shivers with speed and weight, his thumb on the trigger position, his eye in a sight that he trusts more than any speech. This is the pass that pays for the morning. He can feel the Staffel behind him in the way he cannot see them. He counts down the last seconds to a 2-second squeeze, and then the wrong color of wing passes across his nose. There is no space to be clever. He jinks to keep life, loses the clean line, and watches the box slide past unbroken. He swears once flat and short, and pushes for altitude to reform. In his ear, the Schweinfurter's voice is calm and clipped, calling rebuild and spacing, and time to next commit. He feels time tick off in liters. A Bf-109 driver off the far side gambles on holding the commit through the cross. He squeezes too late, the tracers walk nowhere useful, and he has to pull harder than he wanted to clear the tail curtain that suddenly looks thicker than it did on the range. He levels out below the formation and tastes the rubber of his mask as he thinks about the climb back up and whether the fuel reads will permit one more proper pass. He has done this dozens of times. He has not often had his perfect picture vandalized twice in a row by one fighter that refuses to leave the boxes. A high-group fortress takes a spray of cannon fire that cracks the plexiglass and makes the nose smell of hot paint and powder. The pilot keeps his voice even and asks for a feather check. The engineer runs the routine by feel more than sight. The ship wants to drift left. The pilot trims against it. The navigator calls a fractional correction, and the bombardier does not look up. The formation, sensing the change, tightens by a wingspan, without anyone saying the word. Outside, a finishing pass begins to build the way gravity builds a waterfall, inevitable, clean, perfect. The Mustang crosses the lip and the water goes somewhere else. The wounded bomber is still under arcs when the moment where it would have become a straggler expires. Back in the Mustang cockpit, the pilot's neck protests the constant high-to-low scan. His glove sticks slightly on a cold throttle detent, and he thinks once about the gun that will not clear and then forgets it. A shot he could finish presents itself a wounded opponent, rolling out of a failed pass, and he discards it on purpose. The box matters. He can feel the difference in the radio below him when he buys them a minute. The calls get smaller, quieter, and return to routine. That is the only applause he will ever hear for this job. In a German ready room that morning, the leaders had sketched order on a blackboard: vectors, altitudes, times, merges. Order is a fragile thing at 6,000 meters in January. The staffel leader holds it together with voice tone, altitude blocks, and the authority of a man who has returned many times. He knows exactly how much fuel each man should have now, how much will be gone after the next reform, and how narrow the margin is between one more disciplined attack and an engine that will not idle on landing. He tells a section to defer greed and rebuild for a second pass rather than chase the wounded bomber they all want. He watches the Escort hang like a bad idea over the box and feels a small, narrow anger at wasted geometry. He swallows it because anger burns fuel too. The Fortress bombardier rides the last 30 seconds. The sight picture is the world. The flak thumps are just weather. He hears the distant change in engine note when the engineer trims out a tremor and files that away without losing the line. The chin turret fires again, 2 precise bursts, as if to underline the straightness of the run. The interphone goes quiet in that superstitious way crews have when the bombs are almost clear. He feels the ship step light as the racks empty, and only then does he breathe beyond the shallow sips the mask will allow. The Escort pilot takes one more high yo-yo and leaves himself exactly as much energy as the return demands. He looks once at the smoke over the aim point, once at the next bracket that is already coalescing, and then makes the dull correct choice to cross their noses instead of falling into a chase he would win and regret. He can almost hear the navigator below calling turn and the pilot easing the formation into the outbound leg. He will try to be there for the moment when bombers are most tempted to relax and fighters are most desperate to stitch a claim out of the day. For a moment, the corridor is a place of routine again. Crews run checklists that feel like prayers because they are simple and keep hands busy. German pilots level at the reform altitude and listen to fuel tick down while they rebuild the picture. The Escort hangs in the sunline like punctuation that turns long sentences into short ones. Someone in a waist position laughs once at nothing and feels embarrassed by it. Someone in a 190 grinds his teeth and then consciously unclenches his jaw to keep from wasting oxygen. The engineer reaches for a lever and stops his hand to make sure it is the right one. The staffel leader counts to 5 before he keys his mic to make sure his voice is as flat as he wants the day to be. When the boxes make the turn and start home, no one thinks in grand terms. The Fortress crews tally damage, and the Mustang pilot flies a line that is mostly math, and the German pilots make the small decisions that let them land where they launched. The lesson that will appear in debrief notebooks is already written in the way breath sounds on the interphone and in the way the next wave hesitates. It is not dramatic. It is not loud. It is the knowledge that a single Escort present at the right second can turn a slaughter window into a minute of ordinary work. The day worked because a series of quiet decisions upstream put a Mustang over the box at the moment the Luftwaffe expected emptiness. That outcome did not start in the corridor. It started in guidance and in fuel. The guidance came as a shift in purpose. Escorts were no longer ornaments that posed for tallies and then peeled away. The job was to erode the fighter force and protect the run, measured not in victory markings, but in spoiled passes and intact formation geometry. Relay cover to the coast, hand off clean, and then ride the bombers into the blackest minute of the route. If someone had to be bored to keep fortresses alive, it would be the fighter pilot. The relay was a system, not a hope. Controllers kept fighters on the stream axis with brevity calls that cut chatter down to verbs anchor cross reset. Handoffs were timed to geography and whether not wishful lines on a board. Leaders briefed that the reference was the box, not the bandit. A cross at commit was worth more than a chase to the horizon because a cross changed the math for many ships while a chase changed the math for one. When the air grew thin and the flak gate loomed, success was a straight line on a Norden and a stream that felt stapled, not bleeding. Fuel made the guidance real. Drop tanks gave the P-51B the legs to be physically present over the initial point. That margin did not exist by accident. Ground crews bled lines in the cold, so engines would not cough and die after a high-altitude purge. They adjusted lubricants in gun bays, so a short burst would fire when a pilot rationed it. Harmonization meant those rationed bursts still pushed an attacker off the geometry he needed. The bomber side had its own quiet economy. Oxygen topped and checked to the pound. De-ice fluids replenished. Gun belts inspected where a jam had been reported the day before. Turnaround cycles were not about heroics. They were about generating enough serviceable airframes to make today look much like yesterday and tomorrow, because the campaign punished spikes and rewarded steadiness. On the board across the field, the Luftwaffe worked from doctrine that had served it well. The massed carousel was built around a simple truth. A lead box that is unescorted for even a minute can be broken by a disciplined head-on or quartering pass. WGR. 21 rockets could herd a formation and open spacing if the escort picture looked thin. Heavy cannon could punish the first tier and turn it into a kill. Success relied on a stable sight picture, a clean commit, and the absence of a spoiler crossing a nose at exactly the wrong second. Reforms after the first slash were supposed to be brisk and orderly. Passes before and after bombs away were meant to bracket the bombers and peel off cripples. The plan assumed the enemy would abide by its gaps. Sustainment is where plans go to live or die. Each reform burned liters and engine hours. Dispersal to smaller fields kept fighters safer at the cost of taxi time and maintenance friction. Spares thinned. Flak chips and cannon vibration sent more airframes to queues that grew longer as the winter wore on. None of this was dramatic. All of it was decisive in the aggregate, because the carousel was a machine that needed the same quality of energy on the third pass that it had on the first. The men who held formations together, Rottenführer and Staffel leaders, were the irreplaceable components. They could not be manufactured as quickly as airframes could be towed from a factory hall. Every spoiled wave debited their bandwidth and their patience, even when no fighter fell in flames. The command loops on both sides translated friction into choices. Weather split a handoff. Controllers kept escorts from drifting by tightening the axis and calling crosses before the geometry degraded. A flight lead with a wounded opponent in his windscreen discarded the chase to cut 3 converging sightlines instead. A bomber leader read the onset of a spacing tear and called a micro-titan that rescued a damaged ship from becoming a straggler. On the other frequency, ground control vectored interceptors to the merge clock, then watched leaders trade a greedy second pass for a fuel-sure reform because the reserves no longer matched the altitude. Flak schedules and fighter routes overlapped, and those two calendars often fought each other for minutes. The side already over the target with fuel in hand, and a doctrine that prized disruption over pursuit, benefited from that fight. Beneath the cockpit glass, the industrial backplane hummed. On the American side, damaged B-17 seconds and P-51 seconds cleared into depots that had parts and procedures to turn flak-nicked ships into flyers again. Interchangeability and depth kept groups at strength. Crews flowed to fill the gaps that the previous week's losses had opened. The result was not invulnerability. It was repetition, the ability to press the same corridors frequently enough that a single day's luck, good or bad, did not define the campaign. On the German side, output existed and could be brave, but dispersal split effort, transport friction, burned time, and the conversion of new pilots into formation leaders stalled under the weight of attrition. Planned mass arrived late too often, and late mass is fragments. Numbers stayed modest and rooted in cockpit consequences. For the bombers, survivability rose directly with box integrity at the initial point. Each spoiled pass preserved dozens of airmen and the careful work of a lead bombardier who needed a straight line more than he needed a myth. For the interceptors, cost accrued invisibly in fuel time and veteran attention. 3 disrupted waves could exhaust a grouper without tearing the box. For escorts, presence at bombs away was the metric. Tallies were incidental to the mission's math, not its purpose. The case study lay in choices made at speed. A P-51 leader saw a wounded enemy he could almost certainly finish, and chose instead to cross 3 nose lines, just as their guns would have spoken. That choice had a larger footprint than a single victory. It reached into the future minute and kept the run coherent. A wounded fortress began to drag. The lead corrected drift. The formation tightened by a wingspan, and an escort pass at commit turned a likely straggler into a ship that finished the leg under arcs. A German leader counted fuel and altitude after a failed pass and ordered a reform rather than a second try. He would not have had the fuel to complete. Doctrine met logistics and yielded a narrow, prudent decision. A Mustang's stuttering gun forced its pilot to use geometry as his weapon. The jink he forced bought a box the 2 seconds it needed to clear the worst of the gate. Risk and counter-risk pulsed under every minute. Escorts that chased far from the stream handed timing back to the carousel and undid doctrine with vanity. Gunnery or fuel problems tempted a leader to drop early and trust that another group would be where he had been told they would be. That trust failed as often as the weather demanded. German answers existed: a split-axis, head-on married to a high-side follow, could trap an escort in a vertical it did not want. Rockets could shock spacing when deep cover was momentarily displaced by cloud or flak. The day's resolution did not hinge on eliminating those answers. It hinged on escort presence at the bomb run remaining intact long enough that good German setups arrived late. Late at this altitude and speed is the same as survivable for a formation that keeps its shape. What the corridor proved sits exactly inside the day's bounds. Aces who had long counted on deep Reich minutes to turn bomber streams into arithmetic found those minutes compressed by escorts that refused to leave. The system looked like dogfighting on camera, but the engine that made it work ran on fuel spares and discipline. Leadership framed the job correctly, logistics bought the time, and pilots spent it at the exact second when the sight picture was supposed to be perfect for the other side. Before January 1944, the Reich defense ran on a belief that felt like physics. Somewhere deep in Germany, there would be an unescorted minute, and a disciplined sequence of head-on and quartering passes would break a lead box. Before the initial point, rockets could herd the edges, heavy cannon would finish, and stragglers would mark the route home with smoke. The evidence base came from the previous year's penetrations, when escorts thinned over the IP and boxes tore open. Aces planned around that minute the way navigators plan around wind. On 11 January, that script met a small, specific disruption. Cloud displaced escort handoffs, but a P-51B still rode the bomb run. The empty minute never truly appeared. Each time a staffel formed its merge and counted down to a 2-second squeeze, an escort crossed the sight picture at commit and forced a jink. A jink at that instant wastes geometry. The first pass becomes noise recovery, eats altitude and time, and the reform cycle slips past the initial point. The next pass arrives late. Late is not harmless. Bombers still take damage and men still die, but late is survivable for a formation that holds its shape. Over the Oschersleben-Halberstadt corridor, the Luftwaffe's belief fractured at the hinge where timing turns into outcomes. In a cockpit at reform altitude, a Rottenführer scanned fuel and felt the change as arithmetic rather than emotion. He had trained for a carousel that paid off in 2 disciplined waves before bombs away, and he was settling for a single pass that lost its edge to a crossing escort. His Schweinfurt kept radio tone flat, ordered spacing rebuilt, and watched minutes tick toward the aim point. The second pass would be an outbound swing, not an IP breaker. Across several Gruppen, the same realization spread. The unescorted minute was no longer bankable. The day was not a catastrophe. It was a dull drag on the logic that once guaranteed results. Inside the bomber, streamed the shift registered in small human details. A lead bombardier finished a straight run with all defensive positions still manned. A high-group ship that should have fallen out as a straggler was nursed back inside arcs by a micro-titan and a spoiler pass that cut the finishing angle. Interphones sounded routine instead of panicked in the last half-minute to release. None of that looked heroic. It looked like procedure surviving contact because the sight picture that kills procedure at the IP kept slipping. On the escort frequency doctrine hardened into habit. 8 Fighter Command had briefed stay with the box. Now pilots could hear why. An escort lead declined a clean finishing shot on a wounded opponent so he could cross 3 noses at the moment they would have fired. He did not see wreckage. He heard the bomber radios go quiet and steady in the seconds after his pass. That auditory proof mattered more than paint on a fuselage. The metric was spoiled runs and preserved geometry, not tallies. At the ready room level, the perception shift was equally procedural. For the defenders, Group A leaders in the JG-11 and JG-1 belt balanced mass against timing and began to discourage lugging heavy underwing cannon or rockets unless spacing holes were probable. Head-on one and out regained favor when Escort sat over the box at the IP. Burning energy for an improvised second pass, without fuel certainty, threatened to scatter landings across fields, never meant to serve as recovery strips. For the attackers, 8 Fighter Command budgeted vertical resets in fuel plans and tightened brevity around the axis calls that keep fighters centered over the stream. Planners aligned more P-51 legs specifically to coincide with the initial point on comparable targets. The bomber side emphasized recovery routines for near stragglers and forward quadrant discipline around the chin turrets so that a spoiled first pass translated into real survivability. The collapse of the myth appeared most clearly in what people stopped assuming. In German debriefs, frustration centered on wasted geometry and the rising cost of radio discipline needed to rebuild order after a commit cross. Leaders accepted that escorts remaining at the IP changed pass selection and fuel planning. In American debriefs, success notes focused on minutes, not victories, escorts present at bombs-away boxes intact through the flak gate, fewer ships peeled by timing alone. Neither side wrote grand conclusions, both adjusted checklists. 3 vignettes fixed the change. A German leader reading dwindling reserves after a spoiled first pass aborted a textbook second swing and ordered a reform rather than risk arrivals short on fuel. The voice on the radio was flat. The decision narrow the consequence, immediate fewer guns over the IP than doctrine promised. An escort lead at altitude discarded a certain tally and crossed the noses of 3 forming attackers at the instant their sights steadied. In his headset, the cadence below shifted from excited bearings to clean commands for the run. In the nose of a fortress, the bombardier finished his count with all stations alive, aware that nothing miraculous had happened. He had been given a minute of normal work where the old arithmetic said there should be chaos. The operational consequences were modest and specific. More escort legs were plotted to sit over initial points, rather than stack only on ingress and egress. Fuel budgets acknowledged that 1 or 2 high yo-yos at the critical minute were the mission, not a luxury. Bomber leaders drilled micro-Titan responses for damage to prevent the first spacing tear that cascades into loss. Interceptor leaders paced launches to retain energy for outbound attacks, coordinated with flak, rather than expend it all against a protected IP. The same hardware fought the next raids, but the behavior around the hinge minute changed. Limits stayed in view. Weather could still displace escorts and open gaps. Flak could still tear holes no doctrine could instantly mend. When timing aligned, or when a flight lead misjudged the vertical, the Luftwaffe still carried a crushing first punch. The claim remained bounded to deep raids, with continuous escort present at bombs away. Outside that scope, the old risk returned. What broke on the day was not the fighter arm's courage or its aircraft. It was a planning assumption that had survived even into winter, that there would always be a clean, uncovered minute near the aim point. Continuous escort removed the assumption and left both sides fighting for seconds instead of certainties. For the Reich defense, the loss of certainty meant more fuel burned per result, more leader attention spent rebuilding order, and more merges that slipped late. For the 8th Air Force, the gain meant that daylight remained costly but programmable, something that could be scheduled again tomorrow with losses inside a band leadership could accept. The lesson did not need a speech to live. It settled into how pilots set throttle detents before the IP, how controllers phrased axis calls, how formation leaders rehearsed micro-Titan commands, how interceptors trimmed for one clean head-on and a planned outbound rather than a greedy second pass on fumes. That is what an inflection looks like in a sustained air campaign, not a banner headline, but many small choices tilting the averages. In the weeks after 11 January, the lesson traveled faster than any single story. From the debrief room's escort presence at bombs away was the metric. Planning cells at 8 Fighter Command began pegging P-51 legs directly over the initial point on similar routes, budgeting vertical resets as part of fuel plans instead of as discretionary moves. Radio brevity hardened anchor cross reset. Chase distances shortened. A flight lead who kept his section over the stream during the hinge minute was judged effective whether or not anyone painted a tally that day. Bomber groups adjusted with the same procedural calm. Formation drill pushed micro-Titan cues and recovery routines for near stragglers higher in the syllabus. Chin-forward discipline was emphasized, so that a spoiled first pass became more than an interruption. It translated into real survivability on the run. De-ice fluids, oxygen loads, and gun lube choices were treated as mission enablers rather than maintenance trivia. The reward for this work was not safety, only predictability. More runs finished, with all stations manned, fewer ships peeled off by timing alone. Across the belt of central Germany, the ready room language shifted by small degrees. Leaders in Jagdgeschwader 11 and Jagdgeschwader 1 began to favor a clean head-on, one and out, when escorts were known to sit over the box at the IP. Heavy, underwing, fits and rockets became conditional tools, useful for herding, when spacing holes already existed, costly ballast when they did not. Fuel discipline grew stricter. The outbound strike, especially when coordinated with flak, drew more attention as leaders sought effect where the escort picture might briefly thin. None of this changed what a Bf-109 or a Fev-190 could do in a perfect pass. It changed how often perfect passes actually formed. The operational ripples showed up on paper and in tone. Escort plots displayed thicker coverage precisely where bombardiers needed a straight minute. Controller scripts tightened around the axis calls that keep fighters centered over the stream. Debrief notebooks on the bomber side noted fewer stragglers generated by timing alone, and more damage that looked non-decisive when an escort crossed the commit. On the interceptor side, the same sortie effort returned flatter results. More minutes burned in reform, more leader attention spent, rebuilding order after last-second crossings, more landings made with fuel needles deeper into margins than anyone liked. Crews carried forward a human ledger that matched the charts. A Fortress crew now defined a good day as a finished run, with positions still filled and interphone cadence calm in the last half-minute. Mustang pilots internalized the doctrine choice. Discarding a sure kill to cross three noses at the IP became reflex rather than self-denial. German leaders and pilots learned to temper the impulse for a greedy second pass when reserves and altitude no longer aligned, and they talked about rockets as herders, not finishers, unless weather or escort displacement offered a genuine hole. Command climates reinforced the changes. James Doolittle's guidance continued to reward leaders who protected the minute, and William Kepner's staff wrote tasking that made protection physically possible. On the other frequency, Group A leaders pressed tighter radio control at commit and cautioned against energy-starved third passes that ended with scattered recoveries. The result on both sides was not revelation, but a narrowing of assumptions, fewer bets on an uncovered minute, more planning for friction. The numbers that mattered stayed bounded. Escort presence at the IP rose. Chase distances fell. Straggler incidents per mission decreased when escorts sat over bombs away. Fuel per claimed result climbed for the defenders. Leader fatigue was visible in the frequency of reforms that produced pressure, but not breaks. Weather and flak still opened holes. Timing still aligned often enough to bloody a box. Losses remained hard. What changed was the reliability of the hinge minute. When escorts were present, the minute the aces counted on stopped appearing on schedule. Two debates persisted in briefings and halls. If escorts were displaced by cloud at the IP, would drilled Micro-Titan keep losses tolerable, or would the carousel recover its old bite? Would heavier armament mixes matter if passes still arrived late, or would the added weight simply tax the climb back to reform? The answers varied by day, but the framing held daylight was once again something that could be put on a calendar rather than an act of faith in gaps. Daylight did not get safer. It got scheduled. The hinge minute moved from a German assumption to a contested space and procedure. Fuel spares brevity and discipline paid the rent to hold it. Next, corridors would test the same logic against thicker flak belts and weather that pushed handoffs wide. The question ahead was simple and honest. Could escorts and box discipline keep buying routine when everything else tried to turn it back into chance?